Thank you very much. Well, I want to applaud and thank my panelists for participating. What you'll hear when I start to talk about the conservation easements is, quite frankly, where communities and landowners have had the greatest success in preserving meaningful open space, meaningful agricultural landscapes. It has definitely come with some help from the federal programs and even from the state Lee Ray McAllister program, which Celeste nodded to. But if you don't have matching funds within your county, it makes it incredibly hard. And that's one of the reasons that we wanted to talk and start out with this bond process and understand that it is a lengthy process. It takes time, but it is definitely something to be considered because it does become a necessary part to get to some of the matching funds that are required if you want to purchase a conservation easement. So with that, I am going to invite, I know that not all of our presenters can stay on until the end. You're certainly welcome to, but I am just going to move right on in the interest of time, and I am going to share my screen. And I will begin my presentation on Utah open lands and conservation easements and what we do as an organization and land conservation. So I oftentimes start out talking about Utah open lands by telling people what our greatest hits are. And Utah open lands worked really cooperatively with Utah County on the conservation easement that is now protecting Bridal Veil Falls. And as Heinrich mentioned earlier, Conserve Utah Valley was a vital partner in rallying community support to ensure that the county council or the county commission, and obviously that the public was aware of what needed to take place to ensure that Bridal Veil Falls was protected. Other properties that we've worked on include the Redford Family Elk Meadows Preserve, the Redford Family Nature and Wildlife Preserve. I highlight those because those are in Utah County, and also the Redford Family Elk Meadows Preserve also protects that wonderful trail to Stewart Falls, that hiking trail that we all thought was public, but now it's protected forever. Bonanza Flat, we talked about. Albert Kohler, we talked about. Armstrong Snow Ranch Pastures. And then one of my favorite ones that was one of the first agricultural easements in the Salt Lake Valley was the Gene and Dean Whedon Farmland Preserve. But all told, the organization's protected about 64,000 acres working with landowners, and it's all a voluntary process. Even when you're looking at some of these bonds, this is not any sort of condemnation. This is all a voluntary process that we work with the landowners who basically want to exercise their private property right to preserve their land. We all know that we have choices with respect to the land that we own. But for some landowners, the legacy that they want to leave for the next generation is the family farm. What they want to leave for the next generation is the places that they want to play. And that's what a land trust and conservation easements can help do. So just to give you a little bit of a brief history and some background, Utah Open Lands was established in 1990. But I was part of that establishment of Utah Open Lands in 1990. And I think it's pertinent to know that I grew up in Utah County. And I used to ride my horse through the orchards. I did have permission. I just want to make that clear from the outset. I would ride my horse through the orchards and up onto the foothills of Timpanogos. And for me, growing up, I think that was one of the main things that was really, really vital to my development as I was growing up. I think that what shocked me was the fact that my horse outlived all of the orchards that I used to ride through. And so that's one of the reasons that I became committed to working for a land trust and helping to create Utah Open Lands. It was the first local land trust in the state. All land trusts are 501c3 public charities, but they have a special designation under the federal code that enables us to hold conservation easements. I'm not going to get into the details of that. I can certainly help you out with that. It's also on our website if you want to understand more about it. But as Utah Open Lands was going through the process to receive our public charity status to be able to hold conservation easements, we actually made agricultural preservation part of a really fundamental part of our mission, which actually became really critical later because agricultural lands are actually part of a broader category under that federal code. So we felt it was really important to call that out. In Utah, actually, conservation easements are pretty young. 1985 was the enabling statute here in the state of Utah. In 1999, there was a Utah Critical Lands Task Force, and that really became the genesis for the Leray McAllister Critical Lands Fund that has now really become, I think, a great state vehicle for protecting our working landscapes. That's really a lot of the focus that that particular fund has been able to absorb now that it's really working under the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food. And then the first community open space bond was in Park City in 2000. And I think it's just interesting to look at the number of communities throughout our state that actually have passed open space bonds. And if you think of places like Draper City, their whole entire Corner Canyon trail system, which has been a huge quality of life element for the community, was under the threat of significant development, but would not have been protected without a bond. The very first bond they passed was specific to Corner Canyon. But I wanted to speak really quickly, I think about, and this is a picture of the Armstrong Snow Ranch pastures, about really why we protect open space. Because I think a lot of times people look at protecting open space as potentially locking in the fate of the land forever. And I think that what we don't realize is that actually in protecting these open spaces, we are preserving possibilities. We're preserving the possibility of being able to feed ourselves. We're preserving the possibility of being self-sufficient and self-reliant. We're preserving our ability really to maintain a quality of life that at the end of the day really is part of our economic vitality. A lot of us certainly are in situations in our communities where we're continuing to rely on people coming and visiting our communities and enjoying some of the amenities of those communities and spending and leaving the dollars there in order to sustain our economy. But there's another element of open space preservation that we have seen borne out in study after study after study. And we saw it again when we were going through the open space bond process in Wasatch County, because there we actually did a study to determine really, is there a quantifiable way you can get to the quantifiable value of open space? And in fact, open space is a net revenue. For every dollar that you generate in residential development, it actually costs a community between $1.13 and $1.65. For every dollar in agricultural lands, even those under Greenbelt, it only costs a community 65 cents. I like to say that that's because cows don't go to school, right? When we have those residential developments, we also have the services that come along with them. And I bring that up because really what we're talking about is it's about balance. It's about finding those things that are so critical to us as a community and helping those farmers and ranchers that actually are a net revenue to the community to help the community thrive and to help them thrive. That's part of what conservation easements can do. So let's talk a little bit about land conservation, the decision that goes on, the process, and the result. And we heard a lot about how it happens from a government perspective. And now really what I would like to focus on is to talk about how it happens from a landowning family perspective. I've worked with a lot of landowners over the past 33 years. And the thing that's been really interesting to me is that as much as the families are incredibly different, so much of the decision that they make is really very similar. They're typically gathering around a kitchen table and they're talking with everybody about what the future legacy is going to be of their land, of the generational connection that they have to the property. They're usually talking about how brother so-and-so and sister so-and-so doesn't necessarily want to work the farm anymore, but the other brothers do. And so how do you compensate for those that want to continue to be on the land versus those that might want to be moving on? And so I think the first thing that we look at with respect to landowners and going through this process. And Celeste had brought it up as part of their bonding process. But even when you work through any sort of these federal programs, you really want to make sure that you start working with a qualifying entity under 170H of the IRS code. And the reason for that is that oftentimes becomes a huge element to any of the funding sources that you're going to look at. And also, if you wanted to make a partial contribution of the conservation easement value, which we'll talk about why that's important when we talk about funding in a moment, you're going to want to work with an entity that qualifies under 170H. And there are some parallels between Utah's enabling statute, but basically a qualifying conservation entity under 170H is a land trust like Utah Open Lands, again, a 501c3, but that has that extra qualification of having the resources and the commitments to sustain the conservation purpose of the land. It can be a local government. I think you've heard a little bit from the folks on the panel that sometimes the local governments want to have that third partner to help in some of the decisions that come up down the road, to help lock in that charitable intent that was part of the process. And, you know, during rash times to maybe stay the course and ensure that the land is protected, because conservation easements, in order to qualify for many of the different funding options or to qualify under 170H, they have to be in perpetuity, which is a long time. They can also be a national land trust. You have national land trusts like the Trust for Public Lands. There's an organization called the Conservation Fund that had been doing a lot of work around Camp Williams and in the town of Eagle Mountain and that area as a buffer to Camp Williams. There's the Nature Conservancy. There's the Trust for Public Lands. So those are some of your national land trusts that you could work with. And then you can actually work with the state, any sort of government entity like that. And the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food has easement specialists, so they can help you move through the process. But they're also a qualifying conservation entity, as is the Division of Natural Resources. So there are a lot of entities that you can work with. Utah Open Lands happens to be a nationally accredited land conservation organization, which means that we've met the highest standards of the over 13 standards and I think 88 practices that go into ensuring a sound land conservation transaction. So that's something that we bring to the table that we think is valuable, but we also work with a number of our different partners, from government entities to others, just to help to share our knowledge and to ensure that the conservation easement works, you know, for the landowner. But as a landowner, instead of trying to get all of that information yourself, really turning to a land trust organization, or again, one of these state entities that's working on it, there's a lot of information that they can provide to you right up front. And it's all basically free of charge. I have members that support what our organization does so that we can be a resource for the landowners who want to protect their land in perpetuity. So what exactly is this conservation easement that you would be contemplating for your property? Well, you know, the definition of a conservation easement, and I believe actually that this comes from the Farmland Assessment Act under the state of Utah, is I believe where I got this definition. But basically, it's an encumbrance on land for the purpose of preserving areas in a scenic, natural, or open space condition. This includes recreation, cultural, wildlife, agricultural purposes. It is a legally binding agreement, and it is entered into voluntarily by the landowner and the qualifying conservation organization, like a land trust. Really, what I see conservation easements as when I talk to a landowning family is fundamentally it's a visioning document. If you think about the planning and the zoning and all of the things that go into subdividing and developing a piece of property, That takes a lot of time. It takes engineers, it takes all sorts of different opinions and thought processes. And doing a conservation easement is in some ways similar. You're looking at the forward vision of your particular property, and you're looking at what the legacy is that you want to leave, and you're considering all sorts of things about permitted uses, how you want to continue to use the land, and things that you don't want to see happen on the property. And fundamentally, what a conservation easement does is, in order to protect those conservation purposes, the scenic values or the agricultural values, it basically takes the property rights of development and subdivision and some of those things that would defeat the agricultural purpose or defeat the scenic, natural, open, or wildlife value. And you take those development sticks or those development rights and you kind of tie them up in a little bow. And those are the things that are get set aside in the conservation easement that can't be done on the property. And they are enforced by Utah Open Lands. We ensure that that development doesn't take place in perpetuity. Because again, what we're doing is we're protecting this land in favor of those conservation purposes that we talked about by restricting what development can take place on the property. Now, I want to be really clear that when you place a conservation easement on your property, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are restricting every single thing in terms of development. If you're a farmer and you're farming your landscape, it's probably a good idea, if you have a house there, that you can be right there watching the livestock, going out and tending to your fields. So oftentimes there's what we call kind of a building envelope. There may be loafing sheds or a barn that might be central to the agricultural protection that needs to happen. All of those things can be negotiated into a conservation easement, but clearly cookie cutter quarter acre subdivision is not going to qualify when you're trying to protect that particular conservation resource. And I think one of the things to think about is, when we look at protecting land for a specific conservation resource, sometimes I'll get the question of, I have a half an acre in my backyard and I see a deer there every once in a while. Protecting it for the habitat for the deer, if it's only a half an acre and everything around it gets developed, probably is not going to meet the conservation purpose test for wildlife protection. So those are some of the things that the land trust can help you look at as a landowner as you're considering a conservation easement, and what you might be looking at with respect to the different parameters that you want to be able to live with. What do you need to use the property for? What are the things that you are going to restrict? And again, fundamentally, a lot of that comes down to restricting all out subdivision and development. A conservation easement runs with the land in perpetuity. Each conservation easement really is specific to the landowner and the land itself, specific to those conservation values. For example, if you're protecting a scenic view shed, it's actually not what you can see looking out from your property. It's what is the view shed from the public road or from some public trail. What is it that has that public benefit of that scenic view shed? And then in those particular instances, if you did want to retain the right to put in a loafing shed, you'd have to make sure that you maintained the scenic pastoral view shed. So those are the kinds of things that become very specific and very tailored to the particular landscape itself. And then also the landowner and the landowning family, who is going to be the next in line that's going to be working that landscape. And oftentimes we get asked if we can just send out a template conservation easement. And we really shy away from that, because no property is the same. And even though there are similar issues that landowning families face, no landowner is going to be the same. And so we really want to stress and emphasize that conservation easements take time. In fact, I've often said they don't happen overnight. They really do take months and months of planning. The land remains in the hands of the family. So basically, when you think about land ownership, we oftentimes understand that water rights can be separate or separated from the land itself, and it becomes an interest. Well, a conservation easement is essentially an interest in that particular property, but it allows the landowners to continue to own the land and to continue to farm it. They can even pass it on to the next generation or even sell it down the road, but the terms of the conservation easement remain on the title and they remain intact on the property in perpetuity. I think as Celeste mentioned, one of the values that they've looked at as a community is you already have these great stewards of agricultural landowners who are already caretaking these landscapes. And by providing that additional need that they have in terms of some funding, maybe because some of the family doesn't want to farm the property, actually, you can do a conservation easement, and with the landowning family continuing to own it, there's the ability for them to continue to steward it in the way that the community has seen and obviously loved and enjoyed and treasured. And then it is, as I mentioned, binding on the successive owners. And actually, we find that that can be probably the most challenging, is when the land is sold out of the family's hands. That's when it's the most challenging for us as a land trust to ensure that the land continues to be conserved. We've been very successful at continuing to defend all of our conservation easements. But that can be one of the challenges that we face. Typically, the landowning family is good with the restrictions that they put on. So how exactly do we get to what is this value with respect to the conservation easement? Well, in order to look at that, the way that we do it is actually Utah Open Lands doesn't determine the value. We actually go out to an independent qualified appraiser. And that appraiser basically goes through a process that involves comparable sales. It involves looking at market data and market analysis. And basically, they look at the fair market value of the property before the conservation easement. They look at the fair market value after the conservation easement. So, excuse me, in this particular instance, the after value of the conservation easement might remain fairly high because they may have retained the ability to keep the house and to keep some other rights associated with it. But it's basically the difference between the before value and the value after that determine the fair market value of the conservation easement. And that is all done by an independent qualified conservation easement appraiser. They are specifically certified to be able to do qualified conservation easement appraisals. So it is different from just a simple fee title appraisal. So let's talk a little bit about landowner and family considerations and what some of the things are that you might be looking at when you're considering doing a conservation easement. I want to stress the importance of why we started with talking about the bond language. And that is that, again, even though there are federal programs that have significant dollars that can be used for agricultural preservation and even ecological preservation and wetland preservation, which I have to say is absolutely amazing and tremendous. Having been doing this for 33 years, I remember watching other states other than Utah get a large chunk of those federal dollars because we just didn't have matching dollars as a state to basically take advantage of these great federal programs that are not only a way to fund a conservation easement, but the wealth of resource and expertise with the folks on these federal teams, whether it's with NRCS working through their agricultural land easement program, or even some of the stuff with the Department of Agriculture, where they're looking at soil and water optimization elements. All of those expertise are really, really great. But again, we started with the bond conversation because oftentimes you have to be able to have those matching dollars, because funding a conservation easement is not as easy as it sounds. There's a lot of competition for those funds, and land is expensive. And that makes it really tough to be able to fund some of these conservation easements. So part of the reason that I've brought up the purchased versus the donated conservation easement is because in almost every conservation funding program that I'm aware of, you get extra points, if not it being an actual requirement, that you make a partial donation of the conservation easement value. Now, I want to stress here, because usually when I talk about this, people will say, wait a minute, I don't have millions of dollars in cash to make the percentage value contribution. We're not asking for cash. We're asking for the value of the conservation easement. So, for example, One of the things that is really kind of amazing right now is the federal tax deduction. If you're a qualifying farmer or rancher, you can take 100% of your adjusted gross income for 16 years against the value of your gift. So it really allows you to maximize whatever potential percentage of gift you might make. And for a lot of these programs, and I know it's true for Wasatch County and Midway, they really look to the landowner to be contributing about 25% of the value. So if you went back to the $300,000 value that I had before, you'd be looking at 25% of that value would be what you would contribute and you wouldn't get cash for, and then the remaining amount you would. So on a $1 million conservation easement, for example, $250,000 of equivalent value is what you would not get as a landowner. So that's one of the things to consider and to become familiar with, is that there are some benefits. There are even some estate tax planning benefits that a lot of people don't necessarily talk about, but you actually can take an additional 40% off of that raw land value when you pass it on to your kids. Sometimes that can be a huge benefit for landowners. If you're not a qualifying farmer or rancher, you can take 50% of your adjusted gross income for 16 years against the value of the gift. So let's talk about actually getting your conservation easement funded. Again, you heard from the folks on the panel that leveraging is a huge, huge value that they are considering when they're looking at funding a particular property. And so there are different funding sources, and some of those funding sources will have certain restrictions or certain requirements. So if you look at something like the NRCS program, they have an agricultural conservation easement, ALE, agricultural land easement program. They also have a resource conservation partnership program that allows for an even larger regional area. And there are lots of funds right now, especially through the Inflation Reduction Act, that allow for some fundings to go towards these agricultural landscapes. But you absolutely have to be registered with the Farm Services Agency. And that is something that I highly recommend to landowners, that they go and talk to their local Farm Services Agency person before they even approach the process of working through NRCS. When we did the Albert Kohler Legacy Farm, NRCS was a huge and pivotal partner in making sure that that project came to fruition. But we were constantly having to make sure that the landowners had visited with their Farm Services Agency to keep all of that required data updated. And that's something that the land trust actually can't help you move through that process. We can be a cooperating entity with NRCS and work through that, but we can't help you do the Farm Services Agency process. And then there's the Lee Ray McAllister Fund, which is our state open space fund. It's really got a focus, as I mentioned, for working lands. I think Jeremy Christensen is on the Zoom tonight, and he's with the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food. And he's one of those folks that can help you work through the process with respect to the Lee Ray McAllister funds. As Celeste, I think, mentioned, they really prefer that folks that come to their process are already working with a certified land trust organization. And part of the benefit for that, I think, with some of these different funding requirements, is just that we can help go through the process, and we can also help to bring some of those leveraging funds. When you look at the Kohler Dairy, we actually raised significant amount of money from private donors, as well as some of the federal and the state contributions. So again, as I mentioned, a lot of times these funding sources will require a 25% landowner contribution. And oftentimes they will require that there's a 50% contribution to the actual dollars that they bring in. In fact, I think that might be Lee Ray McAllister's requirement, is that they'll fund up to 50% of the project. But the other reason to look at leveraging and getting multiple partners involved and the fundraising aspect is all of these funds, regardless of how much money they have, there is going to be a limit on how much money they can actually allocate to projects And there is a huge amount of interest. In fact, I think in this last round of the NRCS, I want to say they had something like $28 million in requests for limited funds. And so when that is the case, obviously you want to have as many things working in your favor as possible. So let's talk just briefly again about how this works from a bargain sale perspective. Because that's, I think, what most landowners will be looking at in terms of if you have a percentage of the easement that you are contributing. And so basically you can see the machinations of the equation that I've gone through. Let's go back and just revisit that the conservation value determination has to happen first. We have to ensure that there are those conservation purposes. We have to ensure that the landowner uses are in harmony with those conservation purposes we're protecting. You have to have a qualified appraisal. You have to look at potential title issues. If there is a mortgage on the property, oftentimes it will not be able to qualify either under the IRS guidelines or under some of these funding sources. And as you get through a process with some of these federal funding sources, that becomes a huge issue in terms of making sure that there's access, making sure that there aren't encumbrances on the title to the land that would forestall or frustrate actually putting a conservation easement on it. So as you can see in this value where I've made up $1 million conservation or $1 million value of a piece of property, I've said that the conservation easement value is $650,000. There is no set percentage. I'm just giving you those percentages so you can see that. That 650 ends up representing essentially the value of the development rights, for lack of a better way of explaining it. And then the bargain sale value being $487,000 because we're asking the landowner to make a partial gift. So the 75% and the 25% are coming out of that $650,000 value. So again, that $165,000 would not be an actual cash contribution that the landowner would be making. That's coming as a percentage out of that easement value. And so just basically kind of some of the things that you can anticipate seeing when this goes forward is working with an entity. You typically have to have some sort of signed letter of intent or purchase agreement for a conservation easement. Oftentimes that's required by these funding sources. You probably want to see about initiating an appraisal, but you have to be concerned about timing of the appraisal. I can certainly speak to that. We can answer some questions on that. So it's either that signed letter of intent or a purchase agreement. You need to do the due diligence. In some instances, we end up having to get a survey if there are boundary line disputes. There's grant writing that will go into it. There's the title work I mentioned. And then the conservation easement holder or the land trust organization will work with you on drafting the easement language. And then also a key component is basically getting a snapshot of the property by doing a baseline documentation. Typically, after some fundraising, there's the closing, the easement is signed, recorded, and the landowner is paid. After that, some of the things that landowners need to consider is they need to make sure to notice the county assessor that they've placed a conservation easement on the property. If they're under greenbelt, there is the conservation easement rollback relief where you can take it out of greenbelt and not be penalized for the rollback taxes. However, you do, if you want to keep your land in agriculture, you need to make sure to re-enroll, because the conservation easement will affect essentially kind of a change in ownership, even though you're still owning it, that is going to trigger that element. So you want to make sure you work with the county assessor and make sure that you are reapplying for greenbelt if that is necessary. And then from a property tax perspective, there are laws on the books. In fact, former Senator John Valentine from Utah County actually worked to provide the recognition that when you have a conservation easement on it, there's a diminution of value. So with that, I'm going to pretty much stop my presentation. I know that we have some wonderful words we're going to hear from the commissioner basically the role of the land trust at the end of the day is to be a steward with you. And it's an ongoing relationship we have with the landowners. It's actually one of the most enjoyable parts of my job is this continued relationship with the landowners, helping you in any way we can, finding other funding sources, whether it's a county or a city or a landowner for water improvements, or restoration or fencing even. Those are things that we want to become a constant partner in. And our fundamental goal is to forever defend and protect the land from development, honoring the vision and the gift that you end up participating in, either as a funder or as a landowner in one of these processes.